if you're looking to build long-term meaningful relationships, then it's a much more important conversation, and something that both parties need to figure out if we're a good fit for each other. And so
welcome to 33 Tangents, a roundtable discussion covering a wide variety of topics from digital analytics to working remotely to current happenings in business and technology. Your hosts, Jason Thompson, John Naran, Jen Coons, and myself, Jim Driscoll, all live in different areas of the world, but work together in the same company. Our regular day-to-day conversations often go off in various directions, and the goal of this podcast is to share our ideas and find new ways to engage with others.
yeah,
So what's going on?
Not much. Fighting with the school district.
What happened there?
They want me to figure out how to get my kid to school today, and I mean, I just don't know, man. Like we haven't had a snow day in probably 16 years, and they're
Wow.
not calling one today, except the rest of the state has, but our school district hasn't. But I officially called it a snow day. I'm like, you guys, I am not going out in this. The plows have not even dared enter our neighborhood. It's not so much the snow, although it's hard to tell. We got somewhere between 12 and 14 inches overnight.
Wow.
So you can imagine that's a good chunk of snow to deal with. But it's the wind. It's 15 to 20 gusting to 30. And so there's places where we have drifts that are about 3 feet deep. And so it's just the wind is not good. Anyway,
Wow.
I've been trying to contact the school, but their phone lines are down. So that's just not a good sign. Either they're getting overwhelmed by people calling them, or the storm is so bad, it literally knocked out their phone lines. I don't know.
Yeah. Either one should be a sign for them. Like, let's just call off school today, because it makes no sense. Because chances are half the teachers won't show up. Only
It's crazy.
Will.
And we know how to handle snow, but it's crazy. I mean, so the governor tweeted out that all non-essential government employees should not try to get into work until after 12 today. Every school district around us is canceled. The University of Utah closed their campus for the day. I'm like, what are we doing here? Anyway, so that's my morning.
You have a very persistent school.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Where I went to college. So, I mean, I went to college, in suburban Philadelphia, but the president of the school was from Buffalo, New York, I mean, he's used to the massive lake effect snow. So they're like, really, really, really don't expect snow days, because, he kind of goes off of what he's used to in Buffalo, and, not what we're used to here. And I mean, we're pretty good with handling snow, especially the big snowstorms. But he's like, they're like, it's going to take more than a foot of snow for him to actually call off classes.
Yeah. If I get it. I went to school at Utah State up in the northern part of Utah, and I was there for 6 years, and we never had anything close to a snow day except once. But we had tons of snowstorms, big snowstorms, and it was like, you guys can figure it out. You have, put your chains on, put your car in 4-wheel drive, you'll get there and you'll be okay. But we did have one snow day. We got, I think, 26 inches overnight, and it was just way too much for anybody to handle. So it happens.
Yeah. We haven't had, it's been a while since we've had like the really, really, really big snowstorm where things pretty much shut down for a couple of days.
Yeah, I think the latest. So, Jen was saying that her kids were out of school for a couple of days. Was it last week? But it was more for just treacherous roads because of the ice on the roadways. But I guess still technically a snow day.
Yeah. Because I mean, I totally get where she's at, because where she's at, it makes absolutely no sense to acquire and maintain a fleet of plow trucks for that snowstorm you're going to get every 3 years. So, a couple inches of snow, they call everything off.
Yeah.
Because I used to have family in Texas where it was the same thing. They'd get that freak snowstorm or freak ice storm, and everything would shut down.
Yeah. 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 I'm sure it's complicated to shut things down as well, but at some point in time, you have to think about the safety of like the kids, like your teachers. It's not like it used to be, or maybe it didn't used to be like this, but in my mind, um, teachers like taught in their neighborhoods. My mom was a teacher, and she taught in a school just down the street from the house, and so that's always been the picture of in my mind. But I think that isn't really the case. My kids, their teachers come from Salt Lake and other places where they have a 40-hour commute. So anyway, it's it's interesting.
No, and I kind of have that same image too, and I think to a degree it's accurate. In the past, yeah, the teachers came from the local neighborhood or like somewhere surrounding there, whereas now, like my sister's a teacher and she's got a 30-minute commute. My wife's a teacher and she commutes into one of the schools in the city. Um, so they're not necessarily there, so yeah, they do have a crazy commute in. So you have the teachers that have a commute in, and it also feels like many of the schools now, they've kind of widened the radius, especially when you get into the middle schools and the high schools. There's a much wider radius, so you have kids coming from a bit further than maybe where you had 40 years ago.
Yeah, it's a changing dynamic for sure, and it's an interesting conversation just overall. As we've kind of talked a lot about jobs, and obviously we're pro remote and distributed teams, but it's a changing dynamic. There was this set way that people worked, and it was very hyper local, and that's changing. Even if you aren't working remote, we see people having long commutes and moving jobs. And at one point in time, if you were a teacher in a school district or a school, you stayed at that school your entire career. Maybe you moved once, but it was your career, and that's what you stayed. And it's just not the case. There's so much fluidity in jobs and people moving around, and it really stretches out the boundaries. And so it's not the same easy decisions where you have everyone in this isolated community. Everyone's spread out, and I think businesses have to adapt, school districts have to adapt, and they're probably lagging a bit right now because they're basing things on policy of how things operated like probably 15, 20 years ago, and it's no longer the same. Sorry to get us off derailed again. I'm the one that always
No,
derails
no, I
us.
was actually thinking. No, 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 it's fine. No, because I actually think that was a good segue into the plan topic I had for today. Um, so you want to talk about changing and changes, and sometimes when changes are needed. As we're wrapping up our episodes for the month of February, I want to talk about breakups. So I'm the first to admit, when I first got out of college, got that first job, I was a bit naive when it came to some things. And I thought, going into that first real job, that it was good for the business to have as many clients as possible, no matter how they treated you. I mean, I soon came to learn that was a flawed outlook. It maybe took a year or two in there, but I learned it was flawed. And at first, it came as a bit of a shock when I started hearing people talking about the concept of firing a client. And it's something I think people talk more and more about now, or at least it feels like that to me. There are those clients that come into our lives and stay there for the long term, and they're wonderful to work with. And then there are those that we realize at some point the business is better off without, as the relationship is not healthy. It's a toxic relationship. So, to get us started, I'm going to pose a few questions and let's see where it goes. So, when should you make the decision to break up with a client? What should go into that decision? What are the things that you should consider? What happens to an organization where the money that comes in from the client, the money you collect from them via monthly billing or whatnot, is the only deciding factor if when it comes to keeping a client? And one final one, and it's a very obvious question, but yet one I don't think many people understand is why don't you want to keep every client possible?
Yeah, and maybe I'll start there, and I think it's even a broader discussion, and one that I don't know that lots of people really think about. But one of the most important things in my mind for a business is to understand who they're selling to and who their market is. And that may seem like a no-brainer question, but if you go out and ask most people on the street, who's the nighttime talk show host that goes out and does the candid street interviews, and they're funny and silly. If someone went out into any city with a camera and just grabbed 10 random people, I bet like 8 to 9 of those people would say, everybody's your customer. You sell to as many people as you can. That seems to be the commonly accepted approach. Is we want to maximize how much that we can make as a business, and in order to do that, we view the entire world as our customer. And that's simply not the case. Every company to some degree has sat down and thought through what do our customers look like, and whether you're a high volume business like a Walmart, or a very low volume, high luxury car brand that's selling $1 million cars. You have a set marketplace that you're trying to sell to, and one may inherently be larger than the other, but your intended market isn't the entire market. And it's really important to understand who you're selling to, so you can target things properly. So I will just say that number one. And so once you have that understanding, I think that it becomes much easier, right? If you're a restaurant and you have a certain clientele or a certain way that you expect your patrons to behave, it's really easy to kick someone out of your restaurant if they're not living up to your standards. If you're a services company like 33 Sticks and you have a certain clientele that you work with or a certain expectation for your clients, hopefully you figure that out in the sales process and you determine early on if there's a fit or not. But things change a lot over time, and if things change and that's no longer a good fit, then it should be easy to kick them out of your restaurant, and vice versa, right? The same should be true on the client side. You should know as a consumer who you're buying from and make sure that there's a proper fit there. And so we obviously take the view from a services company. When should you break up with the client? When should you tell a prospect they're not a good fit? But honestly, it should be both ways. A buyer should be very informed that they're not just buying a good, they're not just buying a service, they're buying it through a specific channel that needs to be aligned with their values and how they want to think about things. So all too often companies don't think that, or not, sorry, not companies, buyers don't think that way, right? They're looking at it more as a binary. Is this product or is this service aligned with what I need from a delivery standpoint? But buyers should have the same power. They should be able to come to a 33 Sticks, and in fact I've worked with some that do, and say, hey Jason, appreciate what you guys can do. We know that your outputs are high quality, but the size of your company doesn't fit with how we look at buying services, or you guys don't have enough revenue, or we need someone fully on site. And so, it should go both ways. Sorry, I'm rambling. John, Jim, you want to jump in?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely agree it should go both ways. I think so often it it's just that mentality where sometimes the buyer feels like the services company kind of like needs the business and then takes advantage of it. And I think if you're a services company or a provider of any, any a seller of any kind of good, and you're in a fortunate enough position to not need that business to survive, yeah, I think it's totally. I mean, it's a free market both ways, so I don't think you should feel obligated to, just do something purely just for the business.
Yeah,
I mean, a successful business relationship, especially if it's one that is meant to be more long term. So mostly in the case of services, as opposed to just a single transaction. I think for that to be successful, it really needs to be a two-way kind of thing. At least that's the way we always think about
yeah.
our business relationships.
Yeah, and I think you brought up a good point around long term. If you're just kind of expecting a one-time transaction, maybe it's a much different conversation. But if you're looking to build long-term, meaningful relationships, then it's a much more important conversation, and something that both parties need to figure out if we're a good fit for each other. And so getting down into some of Jim's other questions, kind of the specifics of how we think about it, just as companies, and maybe I'll start there. So, as we're in the sales process and we're talking to potential clients, a lot of times we'll get us aligned with their procurement team, and a lot of these major brands. So we work with very large, globally recognized brands. A lot of these brands have policies and procedures in place to reduce risk. So that basically defines who their companies that they work with look like. And oftentimes, gosh, I need to turn my phone off. Sorry. Oftentimes that has to do with size and years in business and revenue and things like that they use to judge stability of companies that they're buying from. But we also have a set list, and it may not be as rigid of that as that, but we look at things like, how much of your budget are you willing to invest in people? Do we have a counterpart on your side that's going to be an active participant in this engagement? Are you looking for a company that you can bring in and just assign a lot of tasks to, or are you looking for a company to come in and truly be a partner with you? So these are some of the questions that I ask up front as we're talking with potential customers, to see if they're a good fit. And if they're not, we've turned away our good share of potential business because of that. And the hope is that long term, that's better for us, that it creates an environment where our employees are happier. And honestly, it's better for the clients that we do take on, because we take on the clients and that we can spend the appropriate amount of time with, and we're not being pulled unjustly in one area because we happen to bring on a client that wasn't a good fit. And I guess, to go back to Jim's question of, it's February and we're talking about breakups, sometimes that changes. Sometimes you bring on a client and it was either a misunderstanding through the sales process and it was never a good fit. But more often than not, it's things change. You get new people in leadership positions, you have new constraints on a business, and things change. And as a services company, you have to be willing to make those adjustments and not just hang on to it for hanging on to its sake. Again, I think we've proven out that it's best both for you as the company and for the client to part ways if there's not a mutual fit there, where both of you are getting the appropriate value out of the relationship.
Unless, of course, you've cracked the key to unlimited resources.
I don't know if anybody has yet, but if they have, then that would be the exception.
Yeah, the disclaimer there.
See, you did it again. You have this habit of, like, as I start to queue up questions in my head, you answer them before I can actually ask it, because I was going to ask you to dig into the fit with it. But let's talk about that a bit more, because there's certain things, like you're talking about, as far as fit goes, that are kind of obvious. So with us being a fully remote organization, a prospect talking about, we need someone on site. We need someone here 4 days a week, 3 days a week, on site all the time. That's kind of obvious. It's not a good fit. Some of the other things on the client side demands is, like, we need, a client, a partner that's this big or something like that, because it makes us feel more comfortable. What are some more of the subtle things that maybe don't jump out as obvious characteristics of a bad fit that you've seen before? Things that maybe looking back you didn't notice, or just learnings over the years that now you recognize that sign, but maybe in the past it kind of flew under your radar because you're looking at maybe some of the bigger things that are more visible.
Man, you're putting me on the spot there. I don't know. There are definitely things that have come up. I think culturally, There are things that early on I just didn't recognize. So it may seem obvious, but how much the company really appreciates analytics. How critical do they view it within their organization? And that may seem like an easy question. These are companies that are spending hundreds, if not millions, of dollars on SaaS service fees every year. You would think they'd be invested, but we've seen the opposite. Where we've seen where companies invested very heavily, but it didn't really matter. It wasn't a core part of their business. But I think some of the bigger things that I've taken away that may not be as obvious really are on the people side, and it comes down to both the right people and their roles, especially as a services company. Our job isn't to come in and just own everything and push everyone out of the way and say we're going to fix everything. Our role really is to come in and be a partner with people in the organizations. And so understanding the right people that we need is critical. And the most obvious is, well, do we have a counterpart on the analytics side? But you know that as we interact with so many different departments, having that infrastructure in place, or having the vision to build out that infrastructure is hyper critical. So do we have a marketing department that is on board? Do we have an engineering team? And this is one that has bit us really hard in the past. Do we have an engineering team that's on board? And by that, I mean, are they bought in, and are they a partner with the team that is bringing us in? Because we've seen where that hasn't been the case. We didn't identify that early enough, and it ended up being pretty catastrophic for everybody. Where when we got in there, we discovered that the engineering team really didn't care what the marketing and finance team wanted to do. They had their own vision. They were deploying their own analytics. There was no cohesion between the two teams. And it really was a battle for 6+ months until we finally kind of mutually said, this isn't working. And so, really understanding beyond just the obvious, which is the team that's hiring to bring you in, um, are the supporting teams that are critical for everyone's success on board. And if they're not, is that part of the scope of our engagement to help ensure they are on board?
Now, like, as you say, like, and again, I don't want this to just be pre-sales or existing clients. So from both sides of it, as you've come to the realization at one point, because, for our organization, you're the one that delivers this message. Um, when you've come to the realization that either a prospect or an existing client is no longer a good fit, you deliver the message that, hey, we no longer, this is, think of this as a good fit. How often do you get the mutual, yep, I think it's time for us to break up? We're no longer a good match for each other. This relationship isn't working out. Or the other one where it's the bad breakup, the yelling, screaming. Like, I'm just curious. And again, I'm since it's February, I am putting that kind of dating relationship slant on things. Like, you've got the good breakup where you both kind of agree, like, yeah, I've been thinking that too. I think it's better we both go our separate ways. But then the other one where the one where one fights the other over the
Yeah,
whole
I mean, unfortunately, I think it's more of the latter. But not to the yelling and screaming, but it really is more emotional. And typically it just, I guess the right term is, it catches them off guard. And not that it's done in a sneaky or deliberate way to harm, but is just not the accepted norm. um Again, I think if you interview most people, random people on the street, they're going to say that everybody wants to sell to everybody. And so the fact that a company would be willing to say, you know what, we're no longer a good fit for each other, we no longer want to take your money, that often shocks people. And the reaction, unfortunately, isn't, okay, let's think through this in a logical way to understand why this is the right move for us. It's kind of hurt. It's a hit on your ego. And so I've either been met with either complete silence, because they don't know how to respond, or I'm met with kind of a backhanded, yeah, you guys weren't good enough for us anyway, right? That usually tends to happen more in the pre-sales process. Once we've had clients and they understand the mutual value, I think that if not for the whole company, there's always a key stakeholder that is like, man, we really appreciate what you guys have done. In fact, I think back through the clients that we've kind of parted ways with over the years, we've always had one or two people that were really, really heartbroken by that, or were really our advocate. In fact, I heard from one that it wasn't really even a direct contact that this client we worked with was, kind of down the chain a bit, and we crossed paths with, and he sent me a random message on LinkedIn and just said, hey, I want to tell you guys I appreciate the way you guys do business, and I saw how you worked when you were engaged with us, and it's the right thing to do. Keep doing it. And those little things are like really reassuring that we're making decisions that are right for us and right for our clients. But to answer your question, I think it's more the latter, that it's unexpected and they're hurt, and it's more just a personal ego thing because they're not expecting that to happen. And a lot of that is these are big brands, and they don't get told no a lot, right? They are usually in a position to dictate the terms of a relationship because companies want to be associated with hot brand X or globally recognized brand Y. So it's very rare that someone breaks up with them or someone tells them no. So, they just honestly don't know how to react to that.
Yeah, you made me think of something when you talk about like the ego and not being told no. Um, there was a client that I wouldn't say we had a shaky relationship with, but at times I think very, very early on, I think we felt a little taken for granted. And again, the whole analogy of a relationship, I'm like, they're massive. So I said, think back to high school. There was always that star athlete, whether it was a quarterback or basketball player. We've all gone to high school with this guy where the girls are just fawning all over him. So he takes them for granted until that one girl comes along that tells him no. You're not worth my time, and then she becomes his sole focus. I mean, they've written movies about this, and I remember when it wasn't, this kind of goes back to a previous conversation where we were talking about tough love. But it was like, let's make it known that, while there's other partners, other vendors that will bend over backwards to have a relationship, we have a little self-respect and don't want to be taken for granted. And it wasn't it wasn't a nasty conversation, but we kind of had that conversation. And since then, the relationship has blossomed, and it couldn't be any better. And at this point, it is incredibly mutually beneficial for both of us.
It's are you thinking about Samantha rejecting Jake Ryan in 16 Candles? I mean, he was so he was such a
Yes.
heartthrob. No, no, but you're right. You're right. There are so many
I mean,
movie scripts set to that exact same scenario that you just described.
yeah, but I mean, I think it's a very real life scenario because in high school I remember, there was that guy, and he took every girl in the class for granted because they all wanted to be with him until that one comes along and she becomes his sole focus. So yes, it's very cliche, but it's also very, very real.
No, it is, and I think it's it's a great visual. Now I'm having like 16 Candles flashbacks in my head, and that also dates me. I have a friend that works at Adobe, and I think he's like 10 years younger than me, and we have like a group of friends, and he's like the youngest in the group, and we're always talking about like movies like 16 Candles and Teen Wolf and like all these like kind of cheesy 80s movies that were the movies of our day. And he's like, I don't even know what you guys are talking about. I'm like, oh my god, we're so old. So I'm sure like 80% of the people listening to our podcast are like, what the hell is 16 Candles? Like, oh, it's a classic.
It is. Um, so to pivot the conversation a bit, because I want to bring John in on this one and get his perspective. I mean, at this point, we've been talking a lot about just a lot of, again, the pre-sale process, determining a fit, and then when to end the relationship. But let's talk about situations, like what actually happens within the organization when it's become to be realized that the relationship with the client is toxic. It's not good, and no one is willing to take that stand, either have that heart to heart with the client to help turn around the relationship, or and not to say that the previous relationship I was just talking about was toxic. It never got to that stage because I think we addressed things pretty early. But when you don't address things, they eventually just build, and the relationship becomes toxic. But what happens to people within the organization when no one wants to kind of stand up and say, okay, this relationship either needs to be fixed or removed? So, John, what are your thoughts? Like, what are experiences that you've had where that's happened?
Hmm. I'm trying to think. I wonder why you singled me out. Do you have a specific do you have a specific use case that you're thinking of? No, but I'm
No,
not.
no,
No.
no. I just didn't want Jason and I monopolizing the time. I was
Oh
just
yeah,
trying
no,
to
no
think of
problem.
something to bring you in on. That was all. No, I don't have any specific examples in
Yeah,
mind.
I'm trying to think really. Yeah, I'm really put on the spot a little bit to be honest, just because I can't think
So
of a
so
Sorry.
situ.
so
Oh
so
no,
let's
not
pivot
at
the
all.
question. Let's
I
pivot the
just can't think.
question a little
Yeah,
bit because we're talking about services companies and clients and vice versa. But I think this extends beyond. We're talking about relationships. That is really what it comes down to. So whether it's between
yeah,
a services company and a client, or teams within an organization, when there's not a good fit, it does create a toxic environment. And so, to Jim's question, have there been examples in your past work history where you've seen that happen to one degree or another, where a toxic environment has been created but no one stands up and addresses it? What happens to um, how do people feel with that? Is it business as usual, or does it truly impact the emotional state of employees?
yeah. It definitely impacts. Yes, I am thinking of situations, toxic environments in within corporate environments. I think it impacts people in a variety of ways. There's But I think the rarest way that, or the rarest result will be someone actually trying to really proactively fix it. In my experience, I feel like there's some people that get very defensive and always kind of have a very like pissed off attitude when when they're exposed to toxic environments over a long time, or toxic relationships at work, and kind of just get very frustrated, very stressed. It's very and a lot of times those people will either eventually leave the organization, or kind of just their productivity will drop a great deal, and it's just a very bad situation. There's others that I feel like will become very um, jaded in a sense, and I think in those cases productivity drops as well. So I mean, I think those toxic relationships, I think the impact of them sometimes extends well beyond maybe the two people or two groups that the that that tension is between. It kind of always has this billowing effect in a much larger radius than I think people realize sometimes. Just even knowing that there's a toxic relationship in one group, I think, can have effects more widespread. Um, and I think that's I'm trying to kind of relate that back to services as well. But going back to just, I think, in order to try to fix something, I think, like, yeah, to Jim's point, you really need to try to have some sort of proactive communication if you want to make things better. Um, and in some cases, that definitely can work. But I think there's other cases where I don't know. I don't know even what the right answer is, but I know I've struggled with that in the past too, where it's like almost the
Yeah.
problem is unfixable in a sense. And I really don't know what to do, to be honest. Like I think there's there's ways you can kind of cope with the problem or not make it worse. But um, I know, like when I worked client side before, I mean, there were cases where there were some people I just avoided, honestly, too, just because like I knew they were kind of toxic types of people, and I just tried to, detour
Yeah.
around them when
So I,
possible.
I want to take a slightly different view of this because I think the words that we use to talk about this often um, color the conversation in a very specific way. So we when we talk about this use we when we talk about this topic, we use words like toxic. We use words like firing clients, and I think it puts the conversation in this view that these are like really bad things that are happening. These are bad people. Bad stuff is happening, and while that does happen and is extremely unfortunate, I think most of the time it's just not a good relationship fit, and that's the reality, right? Like from a business perspective, as I mentioned,
Hmm.
businesses have certain ways that they do things, and they're built to attract a certain set of clients. As people, we have our likes and dislikes. We don't all like the same food, we don't all have the same taste in movies that we like. We're different, right? And when you enter into a relationship, you have to understand if those things are going to be critical. Do they affect the relationship? So are we getting into a relationship where both sides are on such extremes of the political spectrum, like there's no way they're ever going to get along? That may be a deal breaker. Or maybe they have some differences, but they're not that far off, and at least at the core they agree on the same things. That really is at the heart of this conversation. And from a business standpoint, that's what I'm constantly trying to figure out. I know we all have differences, but are those differences outside of the core? Do we at least agree on kind of this core set of values that we have overlap? If yes, we are going to work really, really well together, and we're going to be able to use the differences we have to be even better. And the same for like an employee and an employer, right? As an employee, I should be thinking about those things when I'm interviewing for a job. Does this company, does this CEO, does this boss, do we all have the same core values that we agree on? And while we may have things around that are different, we have that core set of values that we don't question. And again, I just don't think most people think about this. It's, as most people think, as a business I'm trying to sell to everybody, which isn't true. Most people think, and maybe this shows that I'm disconnected, but I think most people think I just have to get a job to get a job. Like, no, you have power as an employee. You should be picking the job that's right for you. And part of that is, does this company's core set of values align with my core set of values? And that's something that I don't think most employees ask. And unfortunately, what happens when there is a mismatch, they get into the job and they're miserable. And again, not because their employer is evil or doing bad things. It's just at the core they disagree, and to them that creates a toxic environment. Whereas to another employee, it may not be toxic. And when that is created, you end up in a scenario where people are miserable. They have a lot of stress and anxiety about doing their job. Their performance suffers. And we see that from a services side. And the last thing that I want to do is create a scenario where our employees are anxious and nervous and depressed about doing their job. That should never happen. And if our productivity drops, it's going to affect the client. And so I think it's fair and to have that open conversation. But again, I think pulling it back from some of those words of toxic and firing the client that kind of jade the conversation in one direction. It's really less about that. I honestly can't think of a situation at 33.6. Now, it's happened in the past where we've just had a client that has abused our employees and we fired them because of that. That's never been the case at 33.6. It's just been more a difference of at the core, we don't have alignment of our core values. And that's okay. And in fact, it's healthy to have that discovery and come to that conclusion that we're just not a good match. And there's lots of matches out there. You need to find someone where your core values align.
Yeah, and that's a really good distinction. I also like you talking about the whole, like, as an employee seeking out a company that you align with, not just taking the first job that comes along. And at some point, I really like to dig into that one too. I'm going to note that down as a future episode, just because. And again, to just like the last conversation, get a little meta at the moment. I think a lot of people live in like have a view that live in a world of scarcity. That they view that I need to get what I can get because that's the only thing out there. So they'll take the first job that's offered to them because they think that's the only thing that they can get. And I think that may even extend into the business side of things. If you have a leader that feels like this is the only business out there, I can't be picky. I'll just take what comes along.
Yeah. And again, I think that really is at the core of our conversations. And I'm often in these podcasts where we're taking a very centric view as far as our experience of building and running a services company, which I hope is very helpful to people, that we're willing to be open and transparent in how we operate. I'm always trying to draw parallels to, well, how does this impact someone that isn't running or working in a services company? How does this impact an employee of a company, or someone that works in another industry or space? And so I always think that we can take the learnings that we have and things, mistakes that we've made, and apply it specifically in this space. So if you're starting your own services company or you're working as a consultant, that hopefully we're sharing things that can be helpful to you. But I think that they're generic enough that we can expand it to the employee, that hopefully, probably the vast majority of our listeners aren't running a services company, aren't working in services. So I want to make sure we're not, leaving them out of the conversation, because I think that there's a lot that they can take away from our experiences here and apply to their view as an employee, as a manager, as a leader.
So I think we've done a really good job of really dissecting this, and I think at some point we really did get to the root of it. Um, so I guess like any final thoughts to wrap up. I'm trying to think of like anything specific around that because I know we try to take like a look at it and try to come up with something concrete or actionable for those listening. But any kind of final thoughts as we start to wrap up?
I mean, I would just echo what I just said, that regardless of your role and where you work, that it's important to build relationships, especially where you're investing so much time at work. So if you're a services company, if you work in sales and you have the autonomy to hand select the clients that are the best fit for your company, if you're an employee, if you're a prospective employee and you're currently out there looking for your next opportunity, I would just strongly advise that, from our experience, it's proven that you can be highly successful, and more importantly, extremely happy and fulfilled while doing that, by aligning your core values with the people that you're going to be spending your most time with. So that would be my takeaway, is really take time up front in the sales process, in the interviewing process, what have you, to understand at the core what the people you're going to be working with, what their core values are, and make some decisions if they align with yours. And if there's things that are outside of that, are they things that can enhance the relationship? Are they things that are going to take away from the relationship? And it should hopefully make your decisions a lot easier.
Yep, very well said. And to add on to that, to take like the employee perspective, if you're at a job and you're working with a particular client that you start to feel like the relationship is starting to go a bit sideways, um, work with your boss to bring those concerns to the forefront. Don't just take a passive role in it, saying, "Well, this is the client I'm assigned, and there's nothing I can do about it." Definitely make that known, that you're seeing that. So this way, it could be corrected before the relationship becomes seriously damaged, or give the feedback that this that this client really is just not a good fit. And then to that too, seek out a boss that is open to that kind of feedback, that they want to hear how the relationship is going, and then it's mutually beneficial for both.
Well said.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's also what was already said, but just when you're starting new relationships or um, in any capacity, it's really just remembering that to take that like a longer term view and kind of go beyond the short term, where there's just it's not just about short term revenue, or that your initial paycheck. It's for it to be successful, it needs to be two ways, and it needs to, you have to have those shared values that we talked about, or um, shared vision or something. But it just needs to you need to have something that you can mutually build upon to be most successful, I think.
Yeah, I think you hit on the right word. It needs to be a relationship, and relationships are
Yeah.
two-sided. Yep. I love that.
Yeah, so do I. So I think with that, we'll go ahead and wrap up for now. Really enjoyed this one, and definitely liked trying to apply the analogies to make have a really fun conversation. But so I guess we'll wrap up for now. We'll talk to everybody later, and thanks, guys.
Yeah, good conversation.
Thank you for listening to this week's episode. We hope you enjoyed it. If you'd like to reach us, you could do so by emailing podcast@33sticks.com or on the web at www.33sticks.com. The 33 Tangents podcast is a production of 33 Sticks.